Have you ever heard of someone who, at the age of 85, decided to lead a battle against giants? It may seem like an unlikely story, but Caleb's journey is just that, one of the most shocking and inspiring accounts in the Bible. While most of the Israelites trembled before the giants who inhabited the Promised Land, Caleb, a man driven by unshakable faith, dared to believe that God's promise was stronger than any obstacle in front of him. Imagine, after decades of waiting in the desert, he finally stood up and said, "Now it's my turn." And what he did next is simply astonishing. Many might think that Caleb had done enough. He survived 40 years of wandering, was faithful when few were, and was at the age when most would have settled down. But instead he challenged all paradigms. Its story provokes us to think, what prevents us from achieving our promises? Are the giants in our lives greater than our God? Caleb shows us that the real secret is not in physical strength or youth, but in something much more powerful. What he did and how he did it changed the course of a nation and left a spiritual legacy that reverberates to this day. Curious to find out how a simple man became one of the greatest warriors in the Bible? The answer may change the way you see the battles in your own life. And the best part? Caleb teaches us that it is never too late to trust God's promises and act with courage. Caleb's unshakable faith. Caleb was one of the few who looked at Canaan with different eyes than the other spies. While most were terrified by the giants and fortified cities, Caleb saw God's faithfulness and his promise. He knew that despite all adversity, the land of Canaan had already been given to Israel by the word of the Lord. And who could go against what God had decreed? This conviction, this unshakable faith that Caleb carried in his heart, made him a singular figure among a people who easily succumbed to fear. The faith he nurtured was not theoretical or just spoken, it was practical and real, something that moved his actions and decisions daily. When Caleb and the other spies returned from the mission Moses had given, there was a clear division between them. 10 of them saw only insurmountable obstacles, but Caleb and Joshua saw beyond. They saw the land of Canaan as the fulfillment of God's promise, even as the giants walked there. Many of us today face challenges that seem greater than we can handle. But Caleb's example shows us that it is possible to move forward by trusting in God's promises. If he could see beyond the giants, we too can look beyond our circumstances and see the blessings God has already prepared. Another impressive point in Caleb's life is that he did not allow himself to be corrupted by the pessimism of the majority. In times of difficulty, it is natural that collective opinion tends to be negative. And how many times does this not happen to us? When things don't go as planned, pessimism spreads like wildfire. But Caleb bucked that tide. He kept his faith steadfast, even when the entire nation of Israel was discouraged. This posture of resistance against the current teaches us a lot. How many times do we stop believing in something because most don't? Caleb inspires us to stay focused on what God has promised us, even if everyone around us says otherwise. The greatness of Caleb's faith is revealed even more when we look at the perspective of time. He maintained that same faith for 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years of waiting, 40 years without seeing the promised land. And yet, he was still steadfast. And if we think about it, most of us would have given up in a lot less time. How many times do we abandon a project or a dream because we don't see quick results? Caleb is the embodiment that faith has no expiration date. He shows us that, as long as the journey may seem, what God has promised will happen, but at the right time. Caleb didn't just wait, he also acted when the opportunity finally came. At the age of 85, with the strength and determination of a young warrior, he presented himself to Joshua and claimed the land of Hebron, the same land that had been promised to him by God. Imagine this, 85 years old and still ready to battle. Hebron, the city where the giants still lived, was conquered by his leadership. This teaches us that it is never too late to achieve what God has promised us. If Caleb didn't let age be an obstacle, we shouldn't let the limitations we impose on ourselves stop us from taking action. This victory in Hebron was not only a physical achievement, but also a spiritual one. The land Caleb claimed was not just a piece of territory, but a symbol of God's faithfulness. He believed the promise, and so he lived it. Hebron thus became a milestone in Israel's history, and Caleb's name was immortalized as someone who chose to obey God, even when it was easier to doubt. And this active faith is something we can apply in our lives. Obedience and trust go hand in hand, and the more we trust, the more we experience God's promises. Caleb's perseverance story. Caleb's perseverance is something rare to find. While many in the wilderness succumbed to impatience and lack of faith, he stood firm for 40 years, awaiting the fulfillment of the divine promise. Imagine spending 4 decades without seeing the fulfillment of a dream that God promised you. Caleb, however, did not waver. He trusted every word the Lord had spoken through Moses. The book of Numbers 14:24 itself confirms this. But my servant Caleb, because there was another spirit in him, and he continued to follow me, I will bring him into the land into which he entered, and his seed shall possess it. Caleb knew that God's promise was true, and he was willing to wait as long as it took to see it fulfilled. During the time of waiting in the wilderness, Caleb not only kept the faith, but also prepared his spirit and body for the time when he would take possession of his inheritance. Hebron, the land promised to Caleb, was not just any land. It was inhabited by giants, which made its conquest a real challenge. But Caleb knew that the God who had made the promise was also the God who would give him the strength to fulfill it. Joshua 14:10-11 reflects this perfectly. And now behold, the Lord has kept me alive, as he said, 45 years ago, since the Lord spoke this word to Moses, while Israel was still in the wilderness. And now behold, I am now 85 years old. And even today I am as strong as the day Moses sent me. What was my strength then, so it is now for war, both to go out and to go in. Caleb's perseverance did not diminish over time. On the contrary, it only grew stronger. Caleb was not a man who only believed in promises. He acted according to his faith. The 40-year wait in the desert might have left many unmotivated, but Caleb saw the journey as part of the process. He understood that obedience to God was crucial, and that the time of waiting was also a time of preparation. While many around him questioned the purpose of this long journey, Caleb stood his ground. The same confidence he showed when he was sent as a spy has lived on all these years. In Romans 5:3-4, Paul reminds us of the importance of perseverance. And not only this, but we also glory in tribulation, knowing that tribulation produces patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. Caleb was a living example of this truth. When the time finally came to take possession of the land, Caleb didn't hesitate. He approached Joshua, reminding him of the promise made by God 45 years earlier. Never mind that he was now 85 years old, Caleb still had the same strength and faith that had driven him from the start. His willingness to fight for what he was promised is a powerful lesson for us. Often, in the face of difficulties, we are tempted to give up, to think that we are no longer able to continue. But Caleb's story shows us that age, waiting time, and obstacles are no impediments when trusting in God. For it is I who know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord in Jeremiah 29:11. And Caleb lived out each of these plans, trusting fully. Hebron, the land Caleb finally conquered, became a landmark of not only a physical, but also a spiritual victory. The city represented the fulfillment of God's promise to Caleb and his descendants. He knew that this land was more than a territory. It was the fulfillment of a covenant made by God. It reminds us that when we are faithful and persevering, God is faithful to keep his promises. Caleb never doubted this, which is why he was able to affirm with conviction in Joshua 14:12, "Now therefore give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke that day. For in that day you heard that there were the Anakim, and great and strong cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me to drive them out, as the Lord has said." The lesson we draw from Caleb's perseverance is that true faith is not limited to believing only in the good moments, but stands firm in adversity. Caleb teaches us that waiting on God's promises is always the best choice, even if it seems to take time. His story echoes the words of James 1:12. Blessed is the man who endures trial, for when he is approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Caleb's patience and unwavering faith show us that regardless of the time, God is faithful to fulfill what he has promised. Hebron's achievement. At 85, Caleb wasn't ready to retire. On the contrary, he stood up with determination and courage to claim the land that God had promised 45 years earlier. Hebron, the land Caleb desired, was known to be home to the mighty Anasean giants. However, Caleb did not see these giants as a threat, but as another opportunity for God to demonstrate his power. His willingness to fight for his heritage, even at an advanced age, is a testament to his faith. In Joshua 14:12 he cries out, "Now therefore give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke that day." He knew that with God's help, the giants and fortified cities could not resist. Caleb led his family in the conquest of Hebron, and the biblical account describes a stunning victory over the giants. Hebron, a city that once struck fear into the hearts of Israel, was taken by the hands of a man who refused to doubt God's promise. This achievement teaches us something powerful. When we trust in God's promises, no obstacle is too great. What seemed impossible to the other spies, Caleb turned into reality through his obedience and faith. In Philippians 4:13, we find a principle that Caleb exemplified perfectly. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He truly believed that God would give him the strength to accomplish what had been promised, and he did. The city of Hebron, in addition to its importance as a physical achievement, had a profound significance. It was a place of rest and spiritual inheritance for the people of Israel. For Caleb, Hebron was the symbol of a promise he had been waiting for decades. The fight for Hebron was arduous, but the reward was worth every battle. The perseverance and faith that Caleb demonstrated on this journey are an example that we often need to fight for the promises God has given us. He empowers us for this, just as he empowered Caleb. When we face our personal giants, whether they be fears, doubts, or hardships, we can trust that, like Caleb, we will be strengthened by God to overcome them. Caleb not only conquered Hebron for himself, but also for his offspring. The land was inherited by his children and grandchildren, a promise that has stretched for generations. This inheritance was a constant reminder of God's faithfulness, and every generation that inhabited Hebron was a living testimony to this truth. Caleb's story teaches us that faith not only benefits us, but also those who come after us. Caleb's obedience impacted his family, just as our faith decisions can impact future generations. Hebrews 11:6 reminds us, "Without faith it is impossible to please God. For whoever approaches him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." Another important point is that Hebron has become a symbol of spiritual leadership. The land was given to a man who demonstrated an unwavering trust in God and who was willing to act on that faith. Caleb did not sit passively, waiting for the promise to be fulfilled. He went after her, trusting that God would give him the tools and strength he needed to overcome the giants. This spirit of active, faith-based leadership is something we can all learn. We should not wait for blessings to simply come to us. Sometimes we need to act with courage and determination, believing that God is with us every step of the way. Finally, Hebron, the city Caleb conquered, was not just a piece of land. It was a sacred place where generations of Israelites would see the fulfillment of God's promise. Caleb lived to see that promise come true, and his story continues to inspire those facing seemingly impossible challenges. If he, at age 85, could trust God to bring down giants, how much more can we trust God's promises in our own lives? Caleb's story in Hebron challenges us to act in faith, fight for the promises, and leave a legacy of obedience for future generations. Caleb's spiritual legacy. Caleb's spiritual legacy is one of the most remarkable in the entire biblical narrative. By conquering Hebron, he not only acquired a territory, but established a framework of active and unwavering faith. Hebron, under his leadership, became a symbol of God's faithfulness, a place where the promise was fulfilled before the eyes of all Israel. The importance of Hebron was not limited to its geographical location, but to what it represented spiritually. It was a constant reminder that God rewards those who trust in Him and act courageously. Caleb's life teaches us that faith is not passive. James 2:26 states, "For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead." Caleb was a living example of this truth. The impact of his faith was so great that his name and his actions became a spiritual legacy to the people of Israel. He came to be remembered as a man who bravely faced the giants, not by relying on his own strength, but on God's strength. Hebron, the city he conquered, symbolized the promise fulfilled, and this served as a beacon for future generations. Caleb's story shows us that when we hold fast to God's promises and act obediently, we leave a legacy that transcends our own lives. As it is written in Proverbs 13:22, "A good man leaves an inheritance for his son's children." Caleb's inheritance was more than a land. It was a testimony of faith and obedience that inspired generations. Caleb not only lived to conquer the promised land, but also to see the impact of his faith on his offspring. Hebron became a holy place where the people of Israel could remember God's faithfulness and the value of obedience. Throughout Scripture, we see the value of spiritual legacy being passed down from generation to generation. The land of Hebron, under Caleb's leadership, became a landmark that God always keeps His promises to those who persevere. In Deuteronomy 7:9 we read, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and mercy to 1,000 generations, to those who love Him and keep His commandments." Caleb's life is a constant reminder of that promise. Caleb's example also shows that regardless of age or circumstances, we can continue to serve God with active faith. Even at the age of 85, he did not allow himself to settle. Caleb could have retired, taken the easy way out, and left Hebron for the younger ones. However, he knew that God's promise was personal and he had a role to play. This teaches us that it is never too late to act in faith and fulfill the purpose God has for us. If Caleb, in his old age, was still willing to lead his family into battle, how much more can we do when we fully trust in God's promises? As Isaiah 40:31 reminds us, "But those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and shall not be weary. They will walk and will not faint." In addition, Caleb's legacy also reflects the importance of an intergenerational faith. He conquered Hebron, but his descendants continued to inhabit the land, living out the promise he believed in. It reminds us of the importance of passing on our faith to the next generations so that they can experience and live out God's promises in their own lives. In Psalm 78:4, we see this principle clearly. "We will not hide them from their children, showing to the future generation the praises of the Lord and His strength and the wonders He has done." Caleb, through his faith, ensured that his family had not only a land, but an ongoing relationship with the God who fulfills His promises. Eventually, Hebron, under Caleb's leadership, became more than just a conquered land. It was a symbol of unwavering trust in God and the reward He offers to those who remain faithful. Caleb lived to see that promise fulfilled, and through that, his life continues to inspire generations of believers to this day. Hebron reminds us that when we trust God, He is faithful to guide us, strengthen us, and give us victory, even if the giants in front of us seem insurmountable. Liberation from Egypt and journey in the desert. Caleb's story does not begin with the conquest of Hebron, but much earlier, in the liberation of Israel from Egypt. Caleb was a witness to one of the most extraordinary events in biblical history, the liberation of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt, led by Moses. He saw up close the miracles that God performed, from the plagues that dismantled Pharaoh's power to the crossing of the Red Sea. This experience strengthened his faith, for he understood that the God of Israel was a God of promise and power. As the people crossed the sea on dry foot, Caleb probably remembered what God had promised, a land where Israel could live free and abundant, the land of Canaan. Psalm 105, 43, 44 reflects this journey. Thus he brought them out with joy, and his chosen ones with joy. And he gave them the lands of the nations, and they inherited the work of the peoples. After the deliverance from Egypt, Caleb was among the 12 spies sent by Moses to explore the land of Canaan. This was the promised land, the final destination after years of slavery. Moses entrusted Caleb and the other spies with the mission of bringing a report on what was beyond the Jordan. However, while 10 of the spies returned with reports of fear and despair because of the giants that inhabited the land, Caleb remained firm in his faith. He saw the same difficulties, but his confidence in God's promise was greater than the size of the giants. In Numbers 13:30, Caleb stood out when he said, "Let us go up boldly and possess her as an inheritance, for we shall surely prevail against it." This spirit of courage and trust in God's word is what set him apart from other spies. Caleb, throughout the journey in the desert, stood out for his unwavering loyalty. He was not influenced by the doubt and murmuring that took hold of the people after the report of the spies. While most of the Israelites feared the giants of Canaan, Caleb kept his focus on God's promise. Because of the unbelief of the people, God decreed that all that generation except Caleb and Joshua would die in the wilderness. Even so, Caleb was not discouraged. He remained steadfast, knowing that in due time he would inherit the promised land. Hebrews 3:19 reflects the lesson we can draw from this episode, and we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Caleb was an example of what it means to trust God, even when everything around him seems to fall apart. The journey in the wilderness was a time of trial for all the people of Israel. Caleb and Joshua, the only 2 faithful spies, had to endure the long years of waiting while their countrymen fell around them. They have seen an entire generation die in the wilderness, but their hopes have never diminished. They knew that God's word would be fulfilled and that the promise of a land in Canaan still stood. Caleb could have been angry or questioned why he had to wait so long, but he remained obedient. The journey in the wilderness can be compared to the trials we face in our own lives. As James 1:3-4 says, "Knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have his perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." During these 40 years of journey in the wilderness, Caleb saw Moses' leadership constantly challenged. He witnessed the rebellion of Korah and other moments of disobedience that brought judgment upon the people. However, Caleb remained faithful to Moses and the leadership God had established. He knew that obedience to God was to recognize those whom he had put in charge. Numbers 16:32-33 recounts one such episode, showing the consequences of the rebellion. And Caleb, alongside Joshua, maintained his loyalty, waiting for the moment to enter the promised land. He understood that true faith is not only about believing God's promises, but also about obeying his leading, even when circumstances are difficult. When they finally reached the threshold of the promised land, Caleb was ready. At the age of 85, he still carried the same faith he had when he first spied on Canaan. The journey in the desert did not weaken him. On the contrary, it strengthened him. Hebron, the land he had been waiting for so long, was before him. The same God who had delivered him from Egypt and sustained him in the wilderness would now enable him to conquer the land. Caleb teaches us that true freedom is not only being freed from slavery, but also trusting God fully throughout the journey until the promise is fulfilled. As Galatians 5:1 says, "Stand firm in the liberty with which Christ has set us free, and do not put yourselves again under the yoke of bondage." Caleb's leadership and courage. Caleb was a leader who stood out not only for his words, but for his actions and courage at critical moments. As one of the representatives of the tribe of Judah, he assumed a position of natural leadership among the people of Israel. His bravery was put to the test when he was sent by Moses, along with 11 other spies, to explore the land of Canaan. While most of the spies returned terrified by the hardships they encountered, the fortified cities and the giants, Caleb demonstrated unwavering faith, asserting that they could conquer the land with God's help. This fearless leadership set him apart from others and solidified his reputation as a man of deep trust in God's promises. In Numbers 13:30, Caleb said with conviction, "Let us go up with courage and possess her as an inheritance, for we shall surely prevail against it." This verse reveals the essence of his character, a leader who believed in action based on faith. Caleb led not only with words of encouragement, but also with a willingness to act. He didn't just talk about God's promise, he was ready to fight for her. This faith-based leadership is something we can apply in our own lives. We are often placed in positions of influence, whether in family, at work, or in our communities, and like Caleb, we need to lead with courage and confidence in the purpose God has given us. His bravery, even in the face of giants, is a reminder that the greatest achievements are preceded by the greatest challenges. Joshua 14:11 offers us another insight into his strength. "And even today I am as strong as in the day that Moses sent me. What was my strength then, so it is now for war, both to go out and to go in." This kind of leadership, grounded in faith and a willingness to face any adversity, is an inspiration to us all. Another aspect of Caleb's leadership was his unwavering loyalty to God and to Moses' mission. When the other spies brought reports that discouraged the people, Caleb and Joshua were the only ones who maintained their trust in the Lord. This loyalty is a mark of true leadership. At a time when popular opinion was dominated by fear and unbelief, Caleb stood firm, knowing that God's word was superior to visible circumstances. Many of us face situations where most around us doubt or give up, but Caleb's example teaches us to trust God above all else. In Proverbs 3:5 we read, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." Caleb lived out this truth, leading in faith and trusting that God would fulfill his promise, regardless of the obstacles. Caleb's leadership was also noted for his ability to patiently wait for God's timing. Not only did he lead the people during the expedition to Canaan, but he remained faithful throughout the 40 years in the wilderness. Unlike most of the Israelites, who murmured and rebelled against Moses and against God, Caleb stood firm, knowing that the promise of the land of Canaan still stood firm. Your patience is a powerful example that true leadership often involves waiting in faith. As Isaiah 40:31 reminds us, "But those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and shall not be weary. They will walk and will not faint." Caleb led by example, demonstrating that waiting on the Lord always brings renewal and strength. Another crucial point about Caleb's leadership is his vision beyond the present. He not only fought for his generation, but also for those that would come after. His conquest of Hebron was not only for him, but for his descendants. A true leader like Caleb always thinks about the impact his actions will have on the next generations. The land he conquered became an inheritance for his family and a symbol of faith for the entire nation of Israel. Hebron, under Caleb's leadership, was a reminder that God keeps his promises, and that message echoed for generations. Psalm 145:4 expresses this idea well. "One generation will praise your works to another generation, and they will declare your exploits." Caleb led in a way that left a lasting legacy, both physical and spiritual. Finally, Caleb's bravery in conquering Hebron teaches us that leadership has no limits of age or circumstance. At the age of 85, he was still willing to fight. He still believed that God would enable him to defeat the giants of the earth. This challenges us to never underestimate our ability to lead and influence, regardless of our age or the difficulties we face. Like Caleb, we must be willing to keep fighting for God's promises, even when the road seems difficult. It reminds us that true leadership is marked by unwavering faith, courage to stand up to giants, and a commitment to leaving a legacy of obedience and trust in God. The conquest of Hebron. Even after so many years, Caleb's faith had not diminished. He stood as strong as the day he was sent by Moses as one of the 12 spies. At the age of 85, Caleb was ready to take on the challenge of conquering Hebron, a land that for many seemed impassable because of the giants who inhabited it. But Caleb didn't see the giants as obstacles. He saw them as opportunities for God to demonstrate his power once again. In Joshua 14:12, Caleb addresses Joshua with confidence. "Now, therefore, give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke that day." He wasn't asking for mercy or for a quiet place. Caleb wanted the very mountain where the giants lived, because he knew the Lord would fight for it. The city of Hebron, which was in the heart of the land of Canaan, was one of the most fortified and inhabited by the Anaxians, a race of giants feared by the Israelites. But Caleb knew that God was with him, and that was all he needed. Hebron symbolized more than a simple territorial conquest. It was the materialization of God's promise to Caleb and to Israel. He went to the battlefield with his family, and under their leadership drove out the giants and took the land. This kind of bravery reminds us that when God makes us a promise, it doesn't matter how big the giants stand in our way. As it is written in Romans 8:31, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" In addition to being a physical victory, the conquest of Hebron was a spiritual milestone. Caleb believed that God had already given that land to him, even before any battle. This complete trust in God's promise is something we can all learn. How many times do we come across situations that seem impossible, and our natural tendency is to retreat? Caleb, however, moved forward with courage because his faith was firmly rooted in God. Joshua 14:14 gives us a testimony of this. Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, because he continued to follow the Lord God of Israel. Caleb's perseverance was the secret of his strength. Hebron, under Caleb's leadership, became a symbol of victory for future generations of Israel. The city was not only a conquered land, but also a place of spiritual heritage. By vanquishing the giants, Caleb not only took possession of what God had promised, but he also left a legacy of faith and courage. He showed Israel that with God, there are no limits. Caleb's active faith transformed Hebron into a holy place where the people of Israel could remember God's faithfulness. In Psalm 37:9, we see this principle clearly. For evildoers shall be uprooted, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the earth. Caleb waited, trusted, and ultimately inherited. Another important point is that Caleb was never someone who backed down in the face of a challenge. Hebron was a strategic location, both militarily and spiritually, and Caleb knew it. His decision to fight for that land shows that he was committed to the mission God had given him, no matter how big the battle was. Many would have chosen an easier path, but Caleb knew that God's promises are worth every effort. He led his troops with the same strength and determination he had decades earlier, showing that true leadership stands firm regardless of the circumstances. This reminds us of Ephesians 6:10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Finally, the conquest of Hebron marked the fulfillment of a promise that Caleb had been waiting for 45 years. The victory did not come quickly, but when it came, it was complete and powerful. This teaches us about God's timing and the importance of waiting on him with patience and faith. Caleb could have given up many times along the way, but he knew that God was faithful and that the promise would come at the right time. Hebron became not only a resting place for Caleb, but also a reminder that God never fails to keep his promises. As Isaiah 55:11 says, "So shall the word that goes forth from my mouth be. It shall not return to me void, but shall do what I please, and it shall prosper in that for which I sent it." Caleb saw this truth fulfilled before his eyes. Moses' intercession and God's chastisement. After the return of the 12 spies that Moses had sent to spy out the land of Canaan, the people of Israel were faced with a dilemma. 10 spies brought a frightening report describing the giants and fortified cities, while Caleb and Joshua insisted that with God's help, it would be possible to conquer the land. However, the people, overcome with fear and unbelief, chose to listen to the pessimistic spies, rebelling against God. The consequence of this rebellion was severe. God decreed that that generation, except Caleb and Joshua, would not enter the promised land. In Numbers 14:23, the Lord declares, "They shall not see the land which I swore to their fathers. None of those who despised me will see it." This moment marked the beginning of 40 years of wandering in the desert. During this period of rebellion, Moses found himself more than once in the position of intercessor. He prayed and interceded for the people, asking God not to completely destroy the nation. In Numbers 14:19-20, Moses says, "Forgive therefore the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your loving kindness." And the Lord said, "According to your word I have forgiven him." Moses' intercession shows us the power of prayer and mediation before God, but it also reminds us of the consequences of disobedience. Even with forgiveness, the generation that doubted the promise would pay the price of their unbelief, perishing in the wilderness before the rising generation could enter Canaan. This episode of unbelief and rebellion teaches us important lessons about the relationship between faith, obedience, and consequences. God had promised the land of Canaan to Israel, but entry into the land required obedience and trust. Caleb and Joshua exemplified this by maintaining their unshakable faith, even in the face of giants. In contrast, the other spies and the people who followed them failed to believe in God's power. Hebrews 3:19 sums up this tragedy, and we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. History reminds us that faith is essential to achieving God's promises, and the lack of it can prevent us from experiencing the fulfillment of those promises. Caleb, in turn, was rewarded for his loyalty. God promised that he and Joshua, by their faithfulness, would see the land and inherit it. In Numbers 14:24, the Lord says of Caleb, "But my servant Caleb, because there was another spirit in him, and he continued to follow me, I will bring him into the land into which he entered, and his seed shall possess it." That other spirit in Caleb was his constant faith and his unstinting obedience to God's word. He did not let himself be carried away by fear or majority opinion, but fully trusted that God would be faithful to his promise. This same willingness to obey and trust God, even in the midst of the most adverse circumstances, is what enables us to live out God's promises in our own lives. God's punishment of Israel during their 40 years in the wilderness was a stark reminder that unbelief and disobedience come with consequences. God is merciful, but he is also just. He forgave Israel, but he did not remove the consequences of his actions. Those who doubted and rebelled against his word could not see the land that had been promised to them. However, Caleb and Joshua, who persevered in their faith, were rewarded. This reminds us of the words of Galatians 6:7. "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap." Caleb sowed faith and reaped the promised land, while the unbelievers reaped the wilderness. Finally, Moses' intercession and God's chastisement teach us about the importance of spiritual leadership. Moses, even in the face of a rebellious people, remained as an intercessor, praying and seeking God's mercy. Caleb, with his different spirit, led with faith and obedience. Both show us that as spiritual leaders, whether in the family, community, or any other sphere of influence, our responsibility is to remain faithful to God and to guide those around us with courage and faith. The example of Moses interceding and Caleb persevering through trials is a call for all of us to be steadfast spiritual leaders who fully trust in God's promises. Caleb's legacy echoes through the generations as a symbol of God's faithfulness and active obedience to his word. His life was a living testimony that true faith is not static. It translates into courageous actions, firm decisions, and an unwavering confidence in the fulfillment of God's promises. Hebron, the land Caleb conquered with his family, was not only a promised land, but an enduring symbol of the loyalty and perseverance of a man who, at the age of 85, was not intimidated by the giants who dwelt there. In Joshua 14:14, it is written, "Hebron therefore became an inheritance from Caleb, for he fully followed the Lord, the God of Israel." Caleb's faithfulness caused him to not only take possession of the land, but also leave a spiritual legacy for his people. Caleb didn't live just for himself. He conquered Hebron for his descendants, and this land became a landmark for future generations. Throughout Israel's history, Hebron has continued to be a holy site, a symbol of God's faithfulness to those who trust and obey. Caleb's legacy is a clear example that true faith leaves a lasting impact. He did not conquer Hebron out of personal ambition, but because he knew that this was the land promised by God, and his obedience was rewarded. Like him, we are also called to live in such a way that our faith is passed on, so that our families and future generations can see and experience God's faithfulness. Proverbs 13:22 reminds us of this. A good man leaves an inheritance to his son's sons. Caleb's story is not only about his physical victory over the giants of Hebron, but also about his spiritual victory over fear, doubt, and disbelief. While many around him succumbed to pessimism and a lack of faith, Caleb stood firm, trusting that God would fulfill his promise at the right time. This is a valuable lesson for all of us, especially in a world where circumstances often try to distract us from our convictions. Caleb teaches us that true victory comes when we stand firm in the faith, even when the evidence around us says otherwise. As Hebrews 10:23 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope, for he who promised is faithful." Caleb's legacy also teaches us about the importance of patience and waiting in God's timing. He could have given up during the 40 years in the wilderness when it seemed like the promise was far away, but he persevered. Often we are tempted to give up on our dreams and God's promises because they do not come true in the time we expect. Caleb shows us that while the wait may be long, the payoff is certain. His patience and obedience were rewarded in a way that exceeded his expectations, and he lived to see the full realization of what God had said. Romans 8:25 encourages us, "But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait patiently for it." In addition to being a man of great faith, Caleb was also a leader who impacted an entire nation. He did not lead with brute force, but with faith and obedience. His life is a reminder that true spiritual leadership is not about power or authority, but about trust in God and willingness to follow his directions, even when the path seems impossible. Hebron became a place of rest and inheritance, not only for Caleb, but for all Israel, a testimony that faith-based leadership bears fruit that endures. Psalm 112:6 states, "For it shall never be shaken. The righteous shall be in everlasting remembrance." Caleb's name has been etched in Israel's history as an eternal example of faith and courage. Ultimately, Caleb's legacy is not just about the victories he achieved, but about the trust he placed in God throughout his entire life. He believed from the beginning that God's promises were true, and that with faith, anything was possible. Hebron is a physical symbol of that trust, but Caleb's true legacy lies in the example he set for future generations. His name continues to inspire those who face giants in their lives, reminding them that God is faithful and that just like Caleb, we too can conquer the impossible when we follow God wholeheartedly. Now that you know the story of Caleb, the faithful warrior who defied giants and conquered Hebron, I ask, what are the giants you need to face in your life? What has been holding you back from achieving God's promises to you? Caleb showed us that with faith and action, even the impossible can be conquered. So why not start fighting for your promises today? Remember, it's never too late to start. You may need to review some attitudes, renew your faith, or make a courageous decision that you have put off for too long. What matters is that you take the first step, just like Caleb did. Now imagine the impact your active faith can have not only on your life, but on generations to come. Caleb didn't just conquer Hebron, he left a legacy. You too can leave a legacy of faith, courage, and obedience. True victory begins when we choose to trust God above our circumstances and act on His promises. So the big question is, are you ready to do it? If this story has inspired you and you want to continue learning and delving in